The glass walls of the meeting room felt like they were closing in as Mira stared at her buzzing phone. She had been in the middle of presenting quarterly reports to Singapore's biggest investors when the hospital's number flashed across her screen for the third time. Her heart skipped a beat. No hospital calls this persistently unless it's serious. "I'm sorry, I need to take this," she whispered, stepping out of the boardroom. The cool air of the hallway hit her face as she pressed the phone to her ear. The voice on the other end was gentle but urgent. Her father had suffered a severe stroke. The words tumbled out of the doctor's mouth. Critical condition. Limited time. Should come immediately. Mira's knees weakened as she leaned against the wall. Her father, the brilliant medical researcher who had buried himself in his work after her mother's death, the man she hadn't properly spoken to in 10 years, was dying. The last real conversation they'd had was that heated argument before she left for Singapore. She had accused him of caring more about his research than his own daughter, and he had just stood there, silent, as always. Back in the meeting room, her colleagues' faces turned to concern as they noticed her pale expression. Family emergency was all she could manage to say. Within minutes, her assistant had booked the next flight to San Francisco, while Mira sat at her desk, staring at the family photo she kept hidden in her drawer. It was from her 12th birthday, the last one before her mother passed away. They were all smiling then. Her father's eyes still held that warmth that seemed to vanish along with her mother. As she rushed home to pack, memories flooded back. The sound of her father's lab door closing late at night, the quiet dinners with only the hum of the microwave for company, the school events where she'd scan the audience hoping to see him, only to find his empty chair. She had learned to stop expecting, stop hoping. It was easier to build walls than to deal with the disappointment. Her hands trembled as she threw clothes into a suitcase. A decade of built-up independence suddenly felt like a fragile shield. She had created a life for herself here. Vice president of a major corporation at just 32, a beautiful apartment overlooking the bay, friends who had become family. She had proved she didn't need him. Yet here she was, hands shaking at the thought of seeing him again. In the taxi to the airport, Mira scrolled through her phone, finding the last photo she had of him. It was from a newspaper article 3 years ago, announcing a breakthrough in his research. He looked older than she remembered, his hair completely gray, his face lined with exhaustion. She had felt proud seeing that article, even though she'd never told him. The evening sky over Singapore was turning purple as her taxi pulled up to the departure terminal. 15 hours of flight time stretched ahead of her, 15 hours to prepare for a reunion she never thought she'd have. As she walked through the airport, Mira realized she didn't even know what she would say to him. Would he even be conscious? Would he recognize her? Would there be time to bridge the gulf of silence that had grown between them? Her phone buzzed again. Another update from the hospital. His condition was deteriorating faster than expected. Mira closed her eyes, fighting back tears as she handed over her passport at immigration. She had always imagined their reconciliation differently. Maybe at her wedding someday, or when she had kids of her own. Not like this. Not in a race against time. As the plane took off, carrying her back to the life she had left behind, Mira watched Singapore's lights fade into the darkness. She had no idea that what awaited her in San Francisco would change everything she thought she knew about her father, about family, and about love itself. The gentle hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as Mira tried to get comfortable in her business class seat. Despite the luxury around her, sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, memories flooded back, some she thought she'd buried deep enough to forget. She remembered the day everything changed. She was 12, sitting at the piano, practicing for her upcoming recital. The sound of her mother's voice drifting from the kitchen, humming along as she cooked dinner. Then the crash of a falling plate, followed by silence. That terrible silence. The flight attendant offered her a cup of tea, bringing her back to the present. Mira's hands wrapped around the warm cup as she stared out the window at the endless darkness. 10 years. 10 years since she'd walked away from home, from him. Her father had turned into a ghost after her mother died, haunting their house in a lab coat, barely speaking except to mumble about his research. She pulled out her tablet, opening a folder she rarely touched. Photos from her high school graduation appeared on the screen. There she was, valedictorian, giving her speech to hundreds of people. Her eyes in the photo kept drifting to that empty chair in the front row. He had promised to come, even marked it in his calendar when she taped the invitation to his lab door. But that morning, she found a note. Breakthrough in the research. Can't leave the lab today. Sorry. The memory still stung. Mira took another sip of tea, noticing how her hand trembled slightly. A young flight attendant noticed and asked if she was okay. Just thinking about my dad, Mira replied, surprising herself with her honesty. He's in the hospital. I'm sure he'll be happy to see you, the flight attendant said kindly. Would he though? The last time they'd spoken face to face, she'd been standing in his lab doorway with her packed bags. I got the job in Singapore, she told him. He hadn't even looked up from his microscope. That's nice, he'd muttered, adjusting the lens. She had waited, hoping he'd say something more, ask her to stay, show any sign that he cared. But he just kept staring through that microscope. I might never come back, she'd added, her voice cracking. That made him pause, just for a moment. But still, he said nothing. So she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing through the empty house. She had waited until she reached the taxi to cry. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, shaking Mira out of her memories. She noticed she'd been gripping the armrest so hard her knuckles had turned white. Opening her phone, she scrolled through work emails, trying to distract herself. But between meeting schedules and project updates, her father's face kept appearing in her mind. Not the distant, distracted father of her later years, but the one from before. She remembered how he used to carry her on his shoulders during their Sunday walks in the park. How he'd let her sit in his lap in his home office, pretending to help him read medical journals. The way he'd beamed with pride when she got perfect scores in science class. Just like your mother, he'd say, his eyes twinkling. What had happened to that father? Had he really disappeared, or had he just gotten lost somewhere in his grief? As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, Mira realized she'd spent 10 years being angry at him for abandoning her, but never once asked herself why he'd retreated so completely into his work. The city lights below grew closer, twinkling like stars fallen to earth. Somewhere down there, in a hospital bed, the man who had become a stranger to her was fighting for his life. And despite everything, the missed recitals, the empty chairs, the decade of silence, she felt a desperate need to reach him before it was too late. Mira touched her mother's old locket, which she always wore around her neck. Maybe it wasn't just her father who had gotten lost in grief. Maybe they both had, each in their own way. As the plane's wheels touched down on California's soil, she made a silent promise to her mother. She would try one last time to find her way back to him. The hospital corridors seemed endless as Mira followed the nurse to the ICU. The smell of disinfectant brought back memories of the last time she'd walked through halls like these, the night her mother didn't come home. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, each step echoing like a ticking clock. He's in here, the nurse said softly, gesturing to a room at the end of the hall. The doctor will be by shortly to discuss his condition. Mira nodded, but couldn't make herself move forward right away. Through the glass window, she could see the outline of a figure in the bed, surrounded by beeping machines. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the room as she approached the bed. She almost didn't recognize him at first. Her father looked so small against the white hospital sheets. His face was pale, his cheeks sunken, and his usually neat gray hair lay messy against the pillow. Tubes and wires connected him to various machines, making him look fragile in a way she'd never seen before. Papa, she whispered, the childhood name slipping out before she could stop it. He didn't stir. According to the nurses, he hadn't regained consciousness since the stroke. Mira sank into the chair beside his bed, unsure what to do with her hands, unsure what to say to this silent version of her already silent father. A worn leather bag sat in the corner. His work bag that he'd carried every day for as long as she could remember. Needing something to do, she pulled it closer. Inside were his usual items: reading glasses, some medical journals, his old tablet. But underneath everything else, she found something unexpected. A thick, leather-bound journal. Mira's hands trembled as she opened it. The first entry was dated exactly 10 years ago, the day she left for Singapore. My dearest daughter left today, it began. I wanted to stop her, to tell her everything, but I couldn't risk it. Not yet. Not until I'm sure. Her heart pounding, she flipped through the pages. There were newspaper clippings about her company's success, printouts of articles mentioning her name, even a copy of the speech she'd given at an international business conference 2 years ago. Between these were his personal notes, all addressed to her. Saw your interview in the Business Times today. You looked so much like your mother, speaking with such passion. I wanted to call and tell you how proud I am, but I know you've moved on. It's better this way. Another entry. Your company's stock rose 40% under your leadership. I always knew you were brilliant, just like her. I hope someday you'll understand why I had to stay away. Tears blurred her vision as she read entry after entry. All this time, she'd thought he didn't care, that he'd forgotten about her in favor of his research. But here was a decade of love, documented in his cramped handwriting. Every achievement, every milestone, every moment he'd missed but clearly longed to be part of. A soft knock interrupted her reading. A woman in a white coat stood in the doorway, her face serious but kind. I'm Dr. Praya, she said. I'm your father's research partner. She paused, looking at the journal in Mira's hands. I see you found his diary. There's something you need to know about your father's work, and why he's really here. Mira looked down at her father's unconscious form, then back at the journal in her hands. The last entry was from just 3 days ago. The treatment is almost ready. I hope I have enough time. I hope she can forgive me when she learns the truth. What truth? Mira asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Priya closed the door behind her. Your father's stroke wasn't random, she said quietly. It was the price he chose to pay to save your life. The heart monitor continued its steady beeping as Mira sat there, the journal heavy in her lap, realizing that everything she believed about the last 10 years might have been wrong. The father she thought had abandoned her had been beside her all along, watching from a distance, protecting her from a truth she was only now about to discover. Dr. Priya pulled up a chair beside Mira, her eyes moving between the unconscious man in the hospital bed and his daughter. The journal still lay open in Mira's lap, her father's handwriting a silent witness to years of untold love. Your mother's death wasn't just a tragic accident, Dr. Priya began softly. She had a rare genetic condition that caused her body to slowly shut down. Your father spent years trying to find out why the symptoms appeared so suddenly. She paused, watching Mira's face carefully. What he discovered changed everything. Mira's hand instinctively went to her mother's locket. She remembered that final year, how her mother would get tired easily, how she started forgetting little things, how her hands would shake when she tried to play the piano. Everyone had thought it was just stress. The condition is hereditary, Dr. Priya continued. When your father realized this, he became obsessed with finding a cure. Not just for your mother's memory, but for you. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a USB drive. This contains 15 years of research. Your father's life work. The room felt too small suddenly, the beeping of the heart monitor too loud. Are you saying I have the same condition? Mira's voice sounded strange to her own ears. The gene is dormant right now, Dr. Preya explained, but it typically activates around age 35. Your father knew he had a deadline. That's why he pushed everyone away. He couldn't bear to watch another person he loved suffer while he worked against time. Memories started shifting in Mira's mind, like puzzle pieces finally finding their proper places. The late nights in his lab weren't about avoiding her, they were about saving her. The missed recitals, the empty chairs, the seemingly cold responses. All of it was him trying to create distance, knowing what might lie ahead. 3 months ago, he believed he finally found a treatment. Dr. Preya said, her voice dropping lower. But he couldn't risk testing it on patients without more proof. So she glanced at the man in the bed, her eyes glistening. He tested it on himself. Mira whispered, the truth hitting her like a physical blow. But he doesn't even have the condition. Why would he? Because untested treatments can be dangerous. He wouldn't risk anyone else getting hurt. Dr. Preya wiped a tear from her cheek. The stroke was a side effect. He knew it might happen, but he did it anyway. He needed to prove the treatment was safe before. She couldn't finish the sentence. Mira stood up abruptly, walking to the window. Outside, the sun was setting over San Francisco, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Her father had watched sunsets like this for 10 years, writing in his journal about her successes, carrying the weight of this secret alone. The treatment worked, Dr. Preya said quietly. The data from his test proves it. He was planning to tell you everything next month, on your birthday. He had it all planned out. The research papers, the medical documents, everything you'd need to understand. He didn't want you to find out like this. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm as Mira turned back to look at her father. In the fading sunlight, she could see traces of the man from her childhood. The one who used to carry her on his shoulders, who taught her to ride a bike, who looked at her mother like she was magic. All these years, she said, her voice breaking, I thought he stopped loving me. But he was actually. She couldn't continue. He was being a father, Dr. Preya finished gently, protecting his child the only way he knew how. Just then, one of the monitors made a different sound. Both women turned sharply toward the bed. Mira's father's fingers had moved, just slightly, against the white hospital sheet. His eyelids fluttered. Papa? Mira whispered, rushing to his side. I'm here. I understand now. I'm here. The hospital room filled with doctors and nurses the moment Mira's father showed signs of waking up. Mira found herself pushed back against the wall, watching helplessly as they checked his vital signs and responses. His eyes had opened briefly, but he hadn't been able to speak yet. You should get some rest, Dr. Preya suggested, touching Mira's arm gently. There's a lot we need to discuss about your father's research, and you've been up for over 24 hours. But Mira couldn't leave. Not now. Not when she finally understood everything. She watched as the medical team slowly filtered out of the room, leaving just one nurse who was adjusting the IV drip. Her father had drifted back to sleep, but his face looked more peaceful now, less drawn with pain. A commotion in the hallway caught their attention. Through the glass walls, Mira could see a group of people in expensive suits walking purposefully toward the room. Dr. Preya's face tightened with worry. The hospital board, she whispered. They're here about the research funding. The board members filed into the room, their faces stern. The chairman, a tall man with silver hair, spoke first. Dr. Preya, we need to discuss the status of this project. The hospital can't continue to fund research that's resulted in. He glanced at the bed, such concerning outcomes. Mira stepped forward before Dr. Preya could respond. This research saved lives, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. My father proved it works. By nearly killing himself. Another board member asked skeptically. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement for the treatment's safety. Dr. Preya pulled out the USB drive. The data is clear. Yes, there were side effects in the testing phase, but the treatment itself is revolutionary. It could help thousands of people with this genetic condition. The chairman shook his head. Without proper documentation of the testing process, without your lead researcher able to explain his methods, this is all circumstantial. We're shutting down the project at the end of the week. Mira felt something snap inside her. All those years her father spent in his lab, all the sacrifices he made, all the love he poured into trying to save her, she couldn't let it end like this. "Give me 3 days," she heard herself say. The board members turned to look at her. "I'm a business executive. I know how to analyze data and present results. Let me and Dr. Pariah show you what this research can do." "And who exactly are you?" the chairman asked. "I'm his daughter, and I'm the reason he did all this." She pulled out her father's journal. Everything he discovered, every breakthrough, every setback, it's all documented here. Between this and Dr. Pariah's knowledge of the research, we can prove this treatment works. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitors. The board members exchanged glances. Finally, the chairman spoke. "You have until Friday morning. If you can't provide conclusive evidence by then, we're pulling the funding." After they left, Dr. Pariah turned to Mira with tears in her eyes. "You don't have to do this. This isn't your burden to carry." Mira looked at her sleeping father, remembering all the times she'd been angry at him for choosing his work over her. Now she understood. He'd chosen her all along, every single day. "He spent 10 years trying to save my life," she said quietly. "I can spend 3 days trying to save his life's work." She pulled out her phone and canceled her meetings for the week. Then she pulled up a chair next to Dr. Pariah. "Show me everything. Start from the beginning." As the night deepened outside the hospital windows, 2 women bent over medical files and research notes, racing against time to preserve a father's legacy of love. And in the hospital bed beside them, for the first time in days, Mira's father smiled in his sleep. Morning sunlight streamed through the hospital windows as Mira rubbed her tired eyes. Papers and files were spread across every surface of the small conference room Dr. Pariah had borrowed for their work. They'd been at it for 24 hours straight, stopping only for quick coffee runs and brief visits to check on her father. "Look at this," Dr. Pariah said, pointing to a graph on her laptop screen. "Your father tracked every test result, every chemical reaction. The patterns are all here, we just need to make sense of them." Mira leaned closer, her business mind kicking in. Numbers and data had always been her strength. It was what made her successful in the corporate world. But these medical terms and complex formulas felt like reading a foreign language. "Wait," she said suddenly, noticing something familiar. "These dates." She pulled out her father's journal, flipping through the pages frantically. "Every time he had a breakthrough, he wrote to me about it. Not just about missing me, but about the research too. He just coded it differently." She read from an entry. "Watched your company presentation online today. You talked about how sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from looking at old problems in new ways. You're right, dear one. Today, I finally understood why the protein sequence wasn't working. We were looking at it backward." Dr. Pariah's eyes widened. "That was the day we restructured our entire approach to the treatment. He never told me what inspired the change." She looked at Mira with newfound understanding. "You were his inspiration all along." They dove back into the work with renewed energy, matching journal entries with research data. Every time her father had watched Mira succeed from afar, it had pushed him to try harder, think differently, find new approaches to old problems. Around midnight, while taking a short break to check on her father, Mira noticed something odd about his work bag. The bottom felt thicker than it should. Her fingers found a hidden zipper, and inside was a thumb drive labeled simply, "For my daughter." Her hands shaking, she rushed back to the conference room and plugged it into her laptop. The screen filled with video files, each dated and labeled. She clicked on the first one. Her father's face appeared, looking younger but tired. "My dearest daughter," he began, "if you're watching this, then either I've succeeded in finding a cure, or—" He paused, swallowing hard. "I need you to understand why I've lived the way I have these past years." Tears rolled down Mira's cheeks as she and Dr. Priya watched video after video. Her father had recorded every major breakthrough, every setback, explaining the science in simple terms his daughter could understand. He'd been preparing these for years, getting ready for the day he'd finally tell her everything. "The answer was in your mother's locket all along," he said in the final video, recorded just days before his stroke. "The metal reacted unexpectedly with the treatment compound. It took me years to realize that what seemed like a contamination was actually the key. Sometimes love shows us the way, even in science." Mira's hand flew to the locket around her neck, the one that had belonged to her mother, the one she'd never taken off. Dr. Priya gasped. Of course, the platinum alloy in vintage jewelry. It could have catalyzed the entire reaction sequence. They worked through the night, fueled by coffee and hope, combining Mira's business analysis skills with Dr. Priya's medical knowledge. The pieces started falling into place, not just the research data, but the story of a father's love, hidden in plain sight all these years. As dawn broke over the hospital, Mira looked at their presentation taking shape on the screen. It wasn't just numbers and graphs anymore. It was a testimony to her father's dedication, proven through documented research, verified results, and most importantly, his own successful treatment. "We did it," Dr. Priya whispered, her voice full of emotion. "We found the proof the board needs." Mira nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. They had just over 24 hours until a board meeting. 24 hours to save not just her father's research, but the lives of countless others who shared her mother's condition. Who shared her condition? Looking out at the rising sun, she touched her mother's locket gently. "I understand now, Papa," she whispered. "I finally understand everything." The morning of the board meeting arrived too quickly. Mira was making last-minute adjustments to their presentation when a nurse burst into the conference room, breathless and excited. "He's awake," she said, "and he's asking for you." Mira's heart jumped into her throat. She looked at Dr. Priya, who nodded encouragingly. "Go. I'll finish up here. The board doesn't meet for another 2 hours." Running down the hospital corridor, Mira's mind raced. What would she say to him? How could she fit 10 years of feelings into whatever brief moment of consciousness he might have? She paused at his door, taking a deep breath. Her father was sitting up slightly, looking pale but alert. His eyes, those kind eyes she remembered from her childhood, found hers immediately. "My little one," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. "You came back." Mira crossed the room in 3 steps, carefully taking his hand. "I found your journal," she said softly, "and the videos. I know everything, Papa." He closed his eyes briefly, a tear rolling down his cheek. "I wanted to tell you so many times. Every time I saw you on business news, every time I read about your success. But I couldn't risk." His voice broke. "Risk my making you stop the research," Mira finished. "Risk my not understanding why you had to find the cure first." She squeezed his hand gently. "But Papa, we could have faced it together." He tried to sit up straighter, wincing with the effort. "When your mother—" He had to pause, even after all these years. "When we lost her, I promised myself I wouldn't watch you go through the same thing. I thought if I could just solve it in time, you'd never have to know the fear she lived with." Mira helped him take a sip of water. "The treatment worked, Papa. Dr. Priya and I spent the last 2 days going through all your research. You did it. You actually did it." His eyes widened. "The board, they need to know. My office." He became agitated, trying to gesture with his weak hands. "Sheh," Mira soothed. "We found everything. The hidden drive, the test results, even the connection to Mom's locket. We're presenting it all to the board this morning." He relaxed slightly, but there was still worry in his eyes. But will they understand? The complexity of the protein bonds, the catalyst effect. Mira smiled, pulling out her tablet. "Let me show you what we've prepared." She began walking him through their presentation, explaining how they'd broken down his complex research into clear, understandable points. How they'd traced the progression of his discoveries through both scientific data and his personal journals. How they'd proven the treatment's success using his own case. As she spoke, she noticed her father watching her with an expression she hadn't seen in years, pure pride. But this time, it wasn't tinged with the sadness she remembered from her childhood. "You sound just like your mother," he said softly. She could always make the most complicated things seem simple. Could always see the heart of any problem. A knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Preya stood there, looking apologetic. "The board is gathering early. We need to go." Mira started to stand, but her father caught her hand. "Wait," he said. "Your mother, she would be so proud of you. Not just for this, but for everything. For who you've become." His voice grew stronger. "And I'm sorry I couldn't show you how proud I was too. I thought staying away would protect you, but—" "You were protecting me," Mira said, bending to kiss his forehead. "You still are. Now it's my turn to protect your life's work." He reached for something on his bedside table, a small key. "In my office, bottom drawer of the desk. Everything you need. It's all there. Every test, every trial. We'll find it," Dr. Preya promised from the doorway. "But now we have to go." Mira squeezed her father's hand one last time. "Rest, Papa. When I come back, I'll tell you all about Singapore. About everything you missed. We have time now." As she walked out with Dr. Preya, Mira felt lighter than she had in years. The board meeting still loomed ahead, but something precious had already been saved. Something worth more than any research could measure. The key felt heavy in Mira's hand as she and Dr. Preya rushed to her father's office in the research building. They had 45 minutes before the board meeting, and every second counted. "Here," Mira said, finding the right door. The office was exactly as she remembered it from her childhood. Walls lined with medical books, a worn leather chair, and the massive wooden desk that had always seemed like a barrier between her and her father. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the bottom drawer. Inside was a thick manila envelope, sealed and marked with today's date. Her father had prepared this, knowing what might happen when he tested the treatment on himself. "Look at this," Dr. Preya breathed, spreading the contents across the desk. Complete testing protocols, detailed results, even backup samples of the treatment compound. Everything the board would need to verify his research. But something else caught Mira's eye, a smaller envelope with her name on it. Inside was a faded photograph she'd never seen before. Her mother was sitting in a hospital bed, holding a newborn Mira, while her father stood beside them, beaming with pride. On the back, in her mother's handwriting, "The day our greatest experiment began." "He knew," Mira whispered. "Even back then, they both knew I might have the condition." She looked at Dr. Preya. "That's why there's so much data. He's been working on this since the day I was born." They barely made it to the boardroom on time, rushing in with arms full of documents. The chairman raised an eyebrow at their disheveled appearance, but Mira didn't care. She felt stronger than she had in days. "Before we begin," she said, standing tall despite her exhaustion, "I want you to look at this." She placed the photograph on the table. This is where the research really started. Not with scientific curiosity, but with love. For the next hour, Mira and Dr. Preya presented their findings. They showed how her father had systematically tracked a genetic condition for decades, how he discovered the crucial link between the platinum in vintage jewelry and the treatment's effectiveness, and how he proven its success through his own sacrifice. "The data is irrefutable," Dr. Preya concluded. "The treatment works. We've already had inquiries from 3 other hospitals about implementing trials. The board members whispered among themselves. The chairman leaned forward. And what are the risk factors? The side effects your father experienced. Mira touched her mother's locket. My father chose to test the treatment at its strongest possible dose, knowing it might harm him. But he also documented exactly how to adjust it for safe patient use. She opened the locket, revealing a tiny USB drive hidden inside. Including this, his final modification to the formula made the day before his stroke. The room fell silent as they reviewed the new data. Finally, the chairman looked up. This is remarkable. Not just the research itself, but the dedication behind it. He glanced at the photograph still lying on the table. Your father's commitment to his patients, to his family. To love, Mira added softly. Everything he did, every moment he spent in that lab, was an act of love. The chairman stood up. The funding will continue. In fact, we'd like to establish a new research wing dedicated to this work. Your father's discovery could help thousands of families avoid the pain yours went through. Relief flitted through Mira. She felt Dr. Praya's hand squeezed her shoulder in celebration, but her mind was already racing ahead to her father's hospital room, eager to share the news. As they walked back through the hospital corridors, Dr. Priya asked, "What will you do now? Will you go back to Singapore?" Mira touched the locket around her neck, thinking of all the years lost to fear and misunderstanding. "No," she said quietly. "I've spent too long running away from love disguised as absence. It's time to come home." The afternoon sun streamed through the hospital windows, casting long shadows that reminded her of childhood evenings spent watching her father work. Only now she understood. Every moment he'd seemed far away, he'd actually been reaching toward her, trying to build a bridge across time itself, made of science and sacrificed and boundless love. 6 months later, Mira stood at the podium in the newly renamed research center, looking out at a room full of faces. Her father sat in the front row, still using a cane but growing stronger each day. The stroke had left its mark, but his eyes were as bright as ever, especially today. "When I flew home 6 months ago," she began, her voice carrying across the hushed room, "I thought I was coming to say goodbye to my father. Instead, I found myself saying hello to the truth about a love so deep it spanned decades of silence." She touched the locket that still hung around her neck, now containing not just memories but hope. "This center will continue the work my father started, not just his medical research, but his mission to transform fear into hope, absence into presence, and lost into legacy." The treatment trials had been successful beyond their hopes. Already, 20 patients with the same genetic condition had shown remarkable improvement. Each success story felt like a gift to her mother's memory, a light pushing back the shadows of the past. After the ceremony, Mira helped her father walk through the garden behind the research center. It was a warm spring day, the kind that reminded her of childhood Sundays before everything changed. "I got the test results back yesterday," she said softly, sitting with him on a bench surrounded by blooming flowers. "The treatment worked, Papa, just like you knew it would." He gripped her hand, tears in his eyes. "I wanted to protect you from knowing fear," he said. "Instead, I made you know loneliness." "No." Mira shook her head. "You taught me that love sometimes looks like an empty chair, but feels like a full heart." She pulled out his old journal, its pages now soft with frequent reading. "Every word you wrote, every breakthrough you recorded, it was all a love letter, wasn't it?" He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Finally, he said, "Your mother always told me I thought too much like a scientist. The heart has its own laboratory," she would say. "But I didn't understand until I almost lost you too." Mira leaned her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar smell of his old sweater. "I've decided to stay," she said. "I'm opening a branch of my company here. No more distance. But your life in Singapore was me running away from memories, she finished. It's time to make new ones. She pulled out her phone, showing him an email. Besides, the research center needs a business director who understands both science and success. The board offered me the position this morning. Her father's smile was like sunrise after a long night. Your mother would have loved that. She always said you had both our strengths, my mind and her heart. A young patient walked past them in the garden, her parents close by. The girl was playing with a tablet, her hands steady and strong thanks to the treatment. She waved at Mira and her father as she passed. That's what love looks like, Mira said softly. Not just in the big moments of sacrifice, but in the quiet victories. In every person who gets to keep their story going because you refuse to give up. The afternoon light turned golden around them, casting long shadows across the garden path. But unlike the shadows of their past, these were gentle, holding no secrets or pain. Papa, Mira said, taking his hand. Let's go home. I'll make tea the way Mom used to, and you can tell me about your new research ideas. We have time now. All the time in the world. As they walked slowly back toward the car, a breeze stirred the flowers in the garden. Somewhere, Mira thought she could hear her mother's favorite piano piece playing faintly, like a memory turned into music. But this time, the melody didn't bring sadness. Instead, it felt like a blessing, a reminder that love never truly leaves. It just changes form, like her father's desperate research transforming into hope for others, like absence turning into presence, like endings becoming new beginnings. The security guard smiled as they passed, holding the door for them. Good night, Dr. Chen. Good night, Ms. Chen. Good night, they replied together, father and daughter, heading home to write the next chapter of their story, together.